Legendary Colombian narco queenpin Griselda Blanco had 4 children: Dixon, Wber, Oswaldo, and Michael Corleone. I already did a video about Griselda's oldest son, Dixon. In this video, I'm going to focus on Wber Esnéider Trujillo, aka El Pitillo or El Piti. He is Griselda's second-born child. The first thing I want to point out is the weird spelling of his name. It's spelled like Wber, but it's pronounced Wber, like the ride-sharing app. I don't think it's a typo because it's spelled like that over 200 times throughout the recently published autobiography by Griselda's son, Michael Corleone Blanco. And in this flyer from Wber's funeral service, his name also seems to be spelled W-B-E-R. Second, I could not find an official birth date for Wber, and what I found in my online research contradicts what his brother Michael says in his recently published book from which I'm getting most of this information. Third, related to the birth date, Wber seems to be much younger than his oldest brother Dixon. Michael says that Wber was born 1 year after Dixon and 10 years before Oswaldo, but look at this photo of the Blanco family. If I told you that Dixon was the father, you would believe me. To say that Dixon is just 1 year older than Wber doesn't seem believable. Wber seems to be closer in age to Oswaldo. Those two, Wber and Oswaldo, look like they're 1 year apart, don't they? Really, it looks like Wber and Oswaldo are 1 year apart and Dixon is at least 10 years older than both. But I digress. Like I said, I'm mainly going to go with what Michael says in his book. And fourth, Wber's life seems to be relatively uneventful in a good way compared to his brothers. He seems to be the narco version of a bon vivant, always a gentleman, a good dude who just wanted to fly under the radar, keep the peace, make a bunch of money, and take care of his people. Perhaps the biggest event of Wber's life is his spectacular death on the orders of one of his family's biggest rivals, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get into the life of Wber Trujillo Blanco. Based on what Michael said, Wber was born around 1959 or 1960, but since I couldn't find an official birth date, don't quote me on that. His father was a man named Carlos Trujillo, who was Griselda's first husband, who died of hepatitis C in 1970. Michael doesn't say much about Wber's childhood, nor was I able to find that much information in the sources that I consulted. This is in slight contrast to Dixon, the oldest sibling, to whom Michael dedicated an entire chapter of his book. While Dixon played a significant role in his family's rise to power in the underworld, supposedly Wber's father didn't want that for him. He wanted Wber to be a doctor, and Griselda would allegedly get upset and grab both Wber and Oswaldo by the ear when either of them expressed interest in becoming narcos. Regardless, Michael says that Dixon taught Wber how to be a narco, and as Michael said, crime ran through his siblings' veins. As a young adult in the 1980s, Wber was an athletic playboy and narco who liked living in the United States. He also liked going to nightclubs and driving expensive cars. Michael says Wber studied business at the University of Miami for some time, and he enjoyed attending both Miami Hurricanes and Miami Dolphins games. He enjoyed racing sports cars and motorcycles, often against his brother Oswaldo, and he spent much of his early adulthood in Key Biscayne, living it up. Wber and Oswaldo in particular made good business partners, and many people wanted to buy product from them. They were responsible for keeping contacts and getting new clients, as well as setting up the best distribution networks, and they took advantage of the experience given to them by their family and associates. In 1985, Wber got arrested with his 2 brothers Dixon and Oswaldo. This was shortly after their mother got arrested. I won't get into the details of that arrest here, but I will say that the brothers were set up by an informant who was close to them, and they all went to prison for a few years. Wber did his prison time in Marianna, Florida, to where Griselda was transferred some time later, long after Wber's release. Wber did his time without much incident so far as I know. By all accounts, he kept it solid, never snitched, and got out in 1991. When he got out of prison, he was deported directly to Colombia. His 2 brothers would meet him there within a few months. According to Michael, Griselda had an attorney in Colombia who was supposed to manage the family's real estate properties in their absence, but the lawyer ended up ripping them off. He pocketed the money and did nothing to improve the properties. If this is true, Michael doesn't say what happened to the attorney, but I can imagine that anyone who ripped off a narco of Griselda's stature basically had a death wish. So when Wber returned to Colombia, everything was a mess. All of the family's properties were in a state of disrepair. Wber rented an apartment and began to lay the foundation for his brothers to eventually return and be able to move money around. It wouldn't be long until the Blanco brothers were reunited. Dixon, who was on parole, simply fled the USA to Colombia and became a fugitive. Oswaldo was deported to Colombia too. At that time, the Medellin underworld was controlled by Pablo Escobar and his young hitmen. It was the 1990s, 1991 to be exact. It was the Medellin cartel's peak and the height of its wars against the Cali cartel. There was lots of death and murder for hire. Medellin apparently had something like 7,000 homicides in 1991. It was one of the most violent cities on earth, and Wber would have to do his best to get back to business in this chaotic, treacherous environment. That being said, all three brothers started trafficking again with old clients and also with new people they had met in prison. And they were able to get Michael to come visit them in Medellin around this time too. So everyone was together. Things were going good for the Blanco clan. But all that would change the day that Oswaldo was murdered. As I've mentioned before, Wber was a gentleman playboy who had no personal enemies, and he lived accordingly. As the saying goes, he who owes nothing fears nothing. One night, Wber went out to a nightclub called La Baviera with Michael. They went with no bodyguards. Nothing bad happened to them, but when Oswaldo found out, Oswaldo was pissed. He upbraided both of his brothers for not being more cautious. The irony of this is that Oswaldo would end up getting killed in a shooting at the same nightclub just a few months later. It did not matter that he went with 3 bodyguards the night he got ambushed by hitmen. I will not get into the spectacular details of Oswaldo's death here. I will do that whenever I make a video about him. That will be the next video I do on the Blanco family. But needless to say, the death of Oswaldo was a major blow for the Blanco clan, as Oswaldo was poised to be a major player in the narcotics business. He was the primary strategist in the family. Michael, on the other hand, had returned to the USA and couldn't get to Medellin for Oswaldo's funeral. He was full of rage and got deeper into gangbanging and street life in California. After Oswaldo's death, Michael doesn't say much about what Wber was up to, but if I had to guess, however, I'd say Wber was likely keeping a low profile and still distributing narcotics. Michael also doesn't say much about who killed Oswaldo in the book, although he talks more about it in other interviews. But like I said, the details of Oswaldo's death will be discussed in another video. The year of Oswaldo's death was around 1992. A couple of years later, Michael reunited with his family in Medellin. Michael returned to Medellin over a drug debt he had to settle with the son of a Venezuelan diplomat. Michael said he was 16 at the time, so that would make the year 1994. The Medellin underworld had also changed by this time. Pablo Escobar was dead, and a man named Don Berna was the most powerful person in the Medellin underworld. When Michael returned, he lived with Wber. Wber's girlfriend had given birth to a child just a few days before Michael arrived. Wber explained to Michael that things had changed, and he laid the rules for Michael in Medellin, basically telling him to stay out of trouble and that he didn't need to worry about money. The main person who Michael lived with while in Colombia was Wber. The two were very close until Wber's tragic death. Things were nice for Michael while he lived with Wber. One morning, in the year 2001, Wber went to the gym for his normal exercise routine. At the time, Wber had access to a bulletproof car, but he decided not to use it that day to go to the gym. That detail is important because his assassins, sent by Papo Mejia, thought Wber would be in a bulletproof vehicle that day, so they hit him hard with all kinds of high-caliber weapons. Wber died on the scene. Apparently, Wber said something to the effect of, "Why me? I haven't done anything to anyone," as he was dying and getting ambushed. Wber's friends and family quickly arrived on the scene after the shooting. Not surprisingly, they all took his death very poorly. When Dixon arrived on the scene and he saw Wber drenched in blood, he damn near fainted. He had had a stroke 2 years earlier and he was no longer the same. He was showing more signs of delusion. Seeing his little brother in such a bad state did not help his mental fitness. Michael says Dixon broke down and like a child, he asked in disbelief, "What happened? Why did it happen again?" Michael said his own mind went blank and he felt dizzy. Wber got hit so badly that his funeral was closed casket. Michael recounted the details of Wber's funeral and how he tried to explain it to his mother. It's all really sad stuff. He didn't tell his mother about it until several days afterward. He just didn't have the heart to tell her, especially since Griselda had had to deal with the death of one son already. After the death of Wber, Michael says he spent some time with Wber's son and also spent some time plotting revenge, which he decided not to go forward with. Ultimately, Michael decided to leave Medellin to be in the USA with his mother. He understood at that moment that the dream of being a top narco had officially ended. The Blanco cartel was over. As mentioned before, it was Papo Mejia who arranged the hit on Wber. Mejia got out of prison, unbeknownst to the Blanco clan, and he made sure he went straight to Mexico, from where he set the plot in motion. Mejia knew that if he went straight to Colombia and not Mexico, he would likely be killed very quickly. According to Michael, his family put a $2 million price tag on Mejia's head. Mejia was able to arrange the hit for about $200,000. In addition to ending the Blanco cartel, the death of Wber ended the war between the Blanco clan and Papo Mejia. The murder of Wber was the death knell for the Blanco cartel. Dixon was too mentally unstable and uninterested in being a narco, and Michael didn't seem up to the task of carrying his family's dark legacy all by himself. Griselda would spend a few more years incarcerated in the United States before returning to Colombia, where she kept a low profile. Michael also mentioned that Wber had a child, but I wasn't able to find much about him. I have no idea where the kid is these days. So what do you guys think of this story? Soon I will upload a video about Oswaldo, the third-born son of Griselda. Please stay tuned.